Don't sing, no matter what you hear. The warning had followed Lena Whitmore her entire life, whispered like a prayer and feared like a curse, until it became the silence she wore like a second skin, invisible but suffocating. And in a kingdom where even the wind seemed to listen, silence was the only thing that kept her alive. The night the sky split open with silver moonlight, Lena moved quietly through the narrow stone corridor of the lower quarters, her worn boots barely making a sound against the cold floor, her hands steady despite the chill that crept through the walls like something alive. Because in this world, control meant survival, and she had learned that lesson long before she understood why. Above her, somewhere far beyond the kitchen smoke and servant whispers, the Alpha King ruled with a presence no one dared describe out loud. A force felt more than seen, like thunder waiting behind a still sky. And they said his senses reached farther than any wolf before him, that he could hear things no one else could, things buried, hidden, forbidden. Lena kept her head down as she passed the open courtyard, where torches flickered and guards murmured in low tones, their voices tense tonight, sharper than usual, as if something unseen had shifted in the air, and maybe it had, because the moon hung too bright, too watchful, casting silver across the stone like a spotlight searching for something lost. She didn't belong in that light, she never had, so she slipped into shadow, into the narrow passage that led beyond the outer wall where the forest began, a place no one important ever went, a place where mistakes disappeared without questions. It was there she heard it first, not a voice, not a word, but a sound, low and strained, like breath caught between pain and endurance, and something in her chest tightened before she could stop it, a pull she didn't understand but couldn't ignore, and against every rule carved into her bones, she followed it. The forest air was colder, sharper, carrying the scent of earth and something deeper, something wild, and she found him just beyond the tree-line, half hidden in shadow, a man slumped against the base of an old oak, his breathing uneven but controlled, as if even in weakness he refused to break, and Lena froze, every instinct telling her to turn back, to leave, to forget she had ever come this far, but she didn't. She stepped closer, slowly, carefully, her heartbeat steady even as something unfamiliar stirred beneath it, something dangerous, something that had been quiet for too long. And when she knelt beside him, she didn't ask who he was, didn't need to, because the air around him felt different, heavier, like the world itself was holding its breath. His eyes flickered open, just for a second, and in that brief moment, something passed between them, something unspoken, something that made her throat tighten with a feeling she couldn't name, and then his gaze darkened, guarded, unreadable, like he was already trying to forget her face. Lena swallowed, her fingers hovering near his shoulder, close enough to feel the heat of him through the fabric, and she knew she should leave, knew this was already too much, too dangerous, but instead she stayed, because some choices aren't made with logic, they're made with something deeper, something that doesn't ask permission. The silence stretched between them, thick and fragile, until the sound escaped her before she could stop it. Not a word, not even a full note, just the faintest whisper of melody, soft as breath, and the moment it touched the air, everything changed. The sound should have died the moment it left her lips, swallowed by the night like every other mistake she had ever almost made. But it did not. It lingered, soft and fragile, hanging in the air between them as if the world itself refused to let it go. And Lena felt it instantly. The shift, subtle but undeniable, like the ground beneath her feet had changed without warning. His breathing stilled, not completely, but enough that she noticed, enough that her pulse quickened with something sharper than fear, and his eyes, those dark, guarded eyes, opened again, wider this time, focused, searching, as though he had just heard something he had been waiting for without knowing it. Lena's throat tightened, and she clamped her lips shut, the echo of that single note still vibrating somewhere deep inside her chest, and for a second, she forgot how to move, forgot how to think, because she knew what she had done, even if it had only been a whisper, even if it had barely been sound. It was still too much, always too much. You. His voice was low, rough at the edges, not from weakness but from something restrained, something held back, and the way he said that single word made the air feel heavier, as if it carried weight beyond meaning. Lena shook her head quickly, instinctively, stepping back before he could finish, before he could ask anything that might force her to answer, because answers were dangerous, and she had survived this long by never giving them. "I did not say anything," she whispered, her voice barely there, careful, controlled, the way she had trained herself to speak, always just enough to exist, never enough to be noticed. His gaze did not leave her, not for a second, and there was something different in it now, something sharper, something that made her skin prickle like the first warning of a storm, and she felt it then, not as a thought, but as a certainty. He was not just listening. He was feeling it, the echo of what she had let slip, the trace of something she was never meant to share. Lena turned slightly, her body already preparing to leave, because staying was not an option anymore. It never had been. But before she could take a step, his hand moved. Not fast, not forceful, but enough to close the distance between them, enough that his fingers brushed against her wrist, and the contact was brief, almost nothing, yet it sent a strange warmth up her arm, startling in its intensity, as if something inside her recognized it before her mind could. She pulled back immediately, her breath catching, her heart beating faster now, not from fear alone, and for the first time, she looked at him fully, really looked, taking in the sharp lines of his face, the quiet strength in the way he held himself even now, injured and still somehow unyielding. And something about him felt wrong, not dangerous in the way she understood danger, but different, like a piece of a puzzle that did not belong anywhere she had ever seen. "Who are you?" he asked, softer this time. But the question carried more weight than before, not curiosity, not suspicion, but something deeper, something that unsettled her more than either would have. Lena shook her head again, stepping back into the shadows, retreating to the only place she knew how to exist, and she forced her voice to stay steady, small, forgettable. "No one," she said, and she meant it, because that was what she had always been, what she needed to remain. But his eyes did not agree, and she saw it clearly, the moment something shifted behind them, something that refused to accept her answer, something that would not let this moment end the way it should. Far above the forest, beyond stone walls and guarded gates, something else stirred, something ancient and aware, and though Lena could not see it, could not hear it, she felt it in the sudden stillness of the air, in the way the night seemed to hold its breath once more, as if the world itself had taken notice of her, and this time, it was not going to forget. Lena did not wait to see what he would do next. She turned and moved quickly, her steps light but urgent as she slipped back through the trees, the darkness swallowing her form as if it had been waiting for her return, and yet the further she went, the less it felt like escape, and the more it felt like something following just behind her, not with sound, not with movement, but with presence, a quiet, relentless awareness that refused to loosen its hold. Her heart beat harder now, not from running, but from the memory of that moment, the way his eyes had changed, the way the air had shifted when that single note left her lips, and she pressed her hand against her chest, as if she could force it all back inside, as if she could undo what had already been done. She reached the stone wall, the cold surface grounding her for a brief second before she slipped through the narrow servant passage, back into the familiar dim corridors where everything was predictable, where silence still meant safety. But even here, something felt different, like the quiet itself had turned fragile, as if it could break at any moment. Voices echoed. Faintly ahead, guards moving faster than usual, their steps sharper, more alert, and Lena slowed instinctively, pressing herself into the shadow of an archway as two of them passed, their conversation low but urgent. He felt it, one of them said, his tone edged with something close to disbelief. "The king does not react like that unless it is real." The other shook his head slightly, scanning the corridor as if expecting something to appear out of thin air. "Orders have already gone out. Every sector, every level. Find a source." Lena's breath caught, shallow and controlled, her fingers curling slightly against the stone as their words settled over her, heavy and undeniable, and she stayed perfectly still until their footsteps faded, until the silence returned, though it no longer felt like protection. High above, in the heart of the fortress, Cale Draven stood motionless near the wide, arched window, the night stretching endlessly beyond him, the silver light of the moon cutting across his features in sharp contrast, and for the first time in years, Something had broken through the steady control that defined him, not shattered, not lost, but shifted, altered in a way he could not ignore. He closed his eyes briefly, not to rest, but to focus, to chase the fading trace of that sound, that impossible sound, the one that had reached him across distance and silence, cutting through layers of stone and instinct as if none of it existed. And even now, he could feel it, faint but undeniable, like an echo carved into something deeper than memory. His hand tightened slightly at his side, not in anger, not in frustration, but in recognition, and when his eyes opened again, they were sharper, clearer, as if something long dormant had awakened with purpose. "Send word to every guard," he said, his voice low but absolute, carrying across the chamber without effort. "No one leaves the inner grounds." The command settled instantly, unquestioned, as the figure behind him inclined his head and moved to obey. But Cale did not move, not yet, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if he could see beyond it, as if he could already trace the path that voice had taken. Somewhere below, hidden within walls built to contain and control, Lena Whitmore pressed herself deeper into shadow, unaware that the distance between them had already begun to close, not with footsteps, not with force, but with something far more certain, something that did not need permission to find her again. Sleep did not come easily that night, not for Lena, not when every sound felt sharper, every shadow deeper, and every breath carried the weight of what she had almost done again, what she had almost become, and she lay still on the narrow cot in the servant quarters, staring at the ceiling as if it might offer answers it had never given before. Around her, the others slept in uneven rhythms, quiet and unaware, wrapped in the comfort of ignorance. But Lena's mind would not quiet. It circled the same moment again and again, the note, the way it had slipped free, the way it had been heard, truly heard, and her fingers curled into the thin blanket as if she could hold herself together by force alone. She had been careful for years, careful not to hum, not to whisper melodies even in her thoughts, careful to bury every instinct that told her to let it out, because she remembered what happened when she did not. She remembered the firelight, the fear, the way people looked at her like she was something they could not understand, something they could not allow, and she had promised herself never again, no matter what. But tonight had not been a choice, not really. It had been instinct, something deeper than fear, something that rose when she saw him, when she felt that strange pull she could not explain, and now the consequences were already moving, already spreading through the walls around her like something alive. The corridor outside was never this busy at night, yet footsteps passed again and again, low voices murmuring, doors opening and closing with urgency instead of routine, and Lena sat up slowly, her breath quiet as she listened, her body already reacting before her mind caught up, because this was wrong, all of it was wrong. She slipped from the bed, careful not to wake the others, and moved toward the narrow slit of a window, just enough to see the outer courtyard. Below, and what she saw made her chest tighten. Torches were lit across every path, guards stationed where there should have been none, their movements coordinated, deliberate, searching. They were not guarding, they were hunting. Lena stepped back instinctively, pressing herself against the cold wall, her pulse steady but heavy, because she understood now, fully, without denial or hope to soften it. This was not rumor. This was not coincidence. It was because of her, because of that single note she had failed to keep hidden. High above, Cale Draven had not moved from his place, not physically, but the stillness around him had changed, sharpened into something focused, something precise, and though the night stretched wide before him, his attention narrowed, drawing inward, tracing the faint thread that connected him to that sound, that voice, the one thing that had broken through every barrier he had ever known. He did not question it, did not dismiss it, because instinct had always been his most reliable truth, and this felt like instinct, like recognition without explanation, like something that had always been meant to find him, even if it had taken years to surface. "She is inside the walls," he said quietly, not as a guess, not as a possibility, but as a certainty that settled into the room with weight, and the man beside him hesitated for only a fraction of a second before bowing his head in acknowledgement, because when the king spoke like that, there was no room for doubt. Below, Lena Whitmore closed her eyes for a brief moment, her hand pressing against her throat, as if she could silence something that no longer belonged entirely to her. And for the first time since she was a child, fear was not the only thing she felt. There was something else now, something quieter but far more dangerous, a sense that whatever had begun tonight was not something she could outrun, not something she could hide from, no matter how silent she became. Morning did not arrive gently. It pressed itself into the fortress with a pale gray light that revealed more than it comforted, and Lena felt it before she opened her eyes, that quiet shift in the air, that sense that something had settled into place overnight and was now waiting, patient and unyielding. She sat up slowly, her movements automatic, controlled, but the weight in her chest had not lessened. If anything, it had sharpened, more defined now that the uncertainty had faded into understanding, because she could not pretend anymore that this would pass, that the world would forget, the way it had always done before. Around her, the other servants stirred, stretching, murmuring, slipping back into routine without noticing how different everything felt, and Lena moved with them, silent, precise, every step measured, as if she could blend into the pattern enough to disappear inside it. The kitchens were already alive with motion, the scent of bread and steam filling the air, familiar, grounding, and she focused on it, on the rhythm of work, the scrape of wood, the quiet exchange of instructions, anything that could anchor her to something normal, something safe. But even here, the tension lingered beneath the surface, in the way people spoke a little softer, listened a little harder, glanced toward the doors more often than usual. "Have you heard?" One of the older workers whispered near the preparation table, her voice low but edged with urgency. "The king has ordered a full search. Every corridor, every servant. No exceptions." Lena's hands did not stop, though her fingers tightened slightly around the cloth she was holding, her breath steady, controlled, because reacting was the one thing she could not afford. "For what?" another voice asked, uncertain, almost afraid to know. The answer came quieter, but it carried more weight. "No one knows. Only that he felt something." The words settled into the room like a presence of their own, unspoken questions hanging behind them, and Lena forced herself to keep moving, to remain nothing more than another shadow in the background, because that was how she survived, that was how she had always survived. But survival felt different now, thinner, like it could tear if she moved the wrong way. Somewhere above, Cale Draven stepped away from the window at last, not because the pull had faded, but because it had sharpened into direction, into something he could follow, and his stride was steady, unhurried, each step deliberate as he moved through the high corridors of the fortress, his presence shifting the air before he even entered a room. Guards straightened as he passed, their attention immediate, absolute. But he did not acknowledge them, not with words, not with gestures, because his focus was elsewhere, drawn inward towards something only he could sense. He paused once, just once, at the intersection of two long corridors, his head tilting slightly, as if listening to something no one else could hear, and for a brief moment, the entire space seemed to hold still with him, waiting. Then his gaze shifted, precise, certain, and without hesitation, he turned toward the lower levels. Below, Lena carried a tray toward the outer corridor, her steps light, her posture composed. But the moment she crossed the threshold, something inside her tightened, sudden and unmistakable, like a thread being pulled, like a presence moving closer whether she wanted it or not. She slowed, just for a fraction of a second, her breath catching before she forced herself forward again, because stopping would only draw attention, and attention was the last thing she could survive. But the feeling did not fade. It grew, quiet but relentless, until it settled into a certainty she could not deny. He was coming, not searching blindly, not guessing, but moving with purpose, moving toward her, and no amount of silence was going to stop it this time. The corridor seemed longer than it had ever been before, every step Lena took echoing just a fraction too loud against the stone, even though she knew she was walking as softly as always, even though she had spent years perfecting the art of going unnoticed. But today the air did not allow for invisibility. It watched, it listened, and she could feel it pressing in around her like something aware. The tray in her hands remained steady, her posture composed, but inside, that quiet pull had sharpened into something undeniable, something that no longer felt distant or uncertain. It was close now, impossibly close, like a presence just beyond sight, and every instinct she had ever trusted was telling her the same thing. Turn away, hide, disappear, but there was nowhere left to go that would not lead him closer. Ahead, the corridor opened into a wider hall, lights spilling in from the high windows above, and for a brief moment, everything seemed still, too still, as if the fortress itself had paused in anticipation of something inevitable. Lena slowed, not enough to be noticed, just enough to steady her breathing, to keep her control intact, because control was all she had left. But the moment she stepped into the open space, it happened. The air changed. It was not a sound, not a movement, but a shift so precise, so immediate, that her entire body reacted before her mind could catch up, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the tray, her breath halting for just a second, because she felt him. Not saw, not heard, but felt, like a presence that did not need to announce itself, like something that simply existed and expected the world to make room for it. At the far end of the hall, he stood. Cale Draven did not move at first, did not speak, but the space between them seemed to narrow without effort, as if distance had lost its meaning the moment he found her, and his gaze, sharp and unyielding, locked onto her with a certainty that sent a quiet shock through her chest. It was not suspicion. It was recognition. Lena lowered her eyes immediately, instinct taking over, her body shifting into the posture she had learned to survive with. Small, unobtrusive, nothing worth noticing, but it did not matter, not this time. His steps were slow, deliberate, each one measured, not rushed, not hesitant, and with every step, that invisible thread between them pulled tighter, drawing something out of her she could not stop, something that had been silent for years but was no longer willing to stay buried. The tray trembled, just slightly, and she stilled it instantly, her breath shallow now, controlled, because any sign of weakness could be seen, could be taken, could expose her in ways she could not undo. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that the air felt different, heavier, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence, stretching, thick and charged with something neither of them needed to name. Then his voice broke through it, low, steady, impossible to ignore. Look at me. It was not loud, not forceful, but it carried something deeper than command, something that reached past her defenses, past the habits she had built to protect herself, and her body reacted before her mind could refuse, her gaze lifting slowly, reluctantly, until it met his. For a second, everything else faded, the walls, the guards, the world beyond that moment, because in his eyes there was something she had never seen before, not directed at her, not at anyone like her, something that felt too focused, too certain, like he had already found what he was looking for. Lena's throat tightened, her pulse steady but heavy, and she forced herself to remain still, to remain silent, because that was the only choice she had ever known. But this time, silence did not feel like protection. It felt like a question waiting to be answered. Lena could not look away, not anymore, because something in his gaze held her there, steady and unrelenting, as if the moment itself had closed around them and refused to let either of them step outside it. And her breath slowed, not from calm, but from the strange clarity that settled over her, the kind that came when there was no escape left to consider. Cale did not move closer, but he did not need to. His presence filled the space between them completely, leaving no room for anything else, no room for denial. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but sharper, as if every word had already been decided before it was spoken. You were in the forest last night. It was not a question, and Lena felt it land with weight, her fingers tightening slightly around the tray before she forced them still, because even the smallest reaction could betray more than she intended. She lowered her gaze again, instinct pushing her back into the role she understood, the one that kept her safe, and her voice came carefully, controlled, as if each word had to pass through layers of restraint before it could exist. I was assigned to gather supplies, she said, and it was not entirely untrue, which made it easier to hold steady, easier to believe that it might be enough. But silence followed, not acceptance, not dismissal, just silence that stretched long enough to feel deliberate. And when she looked up again, his expression had not changed, but something behind it had, something more focused, more certain, as if her answer had confirmed something rather than deflected it. "And you heard nothing," he said. And this time there was something different in the tone, not doubt, not accusation, but expectation, as if he already knew the answer and was simply waiting to see if she would give it. Lena's throat tightened, the memory of that single note rising unbidden, the way it had felt leaving her, the way it had been received, and for a second, her control slipped just enough for fear to press through, sharp and undeniable. "No," she replied, softer now, but no less deliberate, and she held his gaze just long enough to make it real, to make it convincing, because she had learned that avoidance only drew more attention, and she could not afford that now. His eyes did not leave hers, and the quiet between them shifted again, something almost imperceptible but powerful enough that Lena felt it deep in her chest, like a second heartbeat that did not belong to her alone, and it unsettled her in a way fear never had, because fear was familiar, predictable, but this was not. Kale's gaze dropped briefly, not away, but down, to her hands, to the tray she still held with careful precision, and then back to her face. And when he spoke again, the words were softer, but carried more weight than anything before. "You are very good at being quiet." Lena felt the truth of it settle into her bones, because it was not a compliment. Not really. It was an observation, one that saw through the surface and into something she had spent years hiding, and for the first time, she did not know how to respond. The corridor remained still around them, the guards at a distance, waiting, watching without interfering, because no one stepped into the space the king occupied unless commanded, and that silence stretched just long enough for Lena to realize something she had been trying not to understand since the moment he looked at her. He was not searching anymore. He had found her. Kale straightened slightly, the shift subtle but final, as if something had settled into place within him, and when he spoke again, there was no question left in his voice, no uncertainty, only quiet certainty that left no room for anything else. "Walk with me." It was not a request, not something she could refuse, and Lena hesitated for only a fraction of a second before moving, because refusing would draw more attention, more danger, and she could not risk that, not now, not when everything had already begun to unravel. She stepped beside him, her pace measured, her posture controlled, but inside, that quiet pull had grown stronger, clearer, and with every step they took together, it felt less like something she could resist and more like something she had never been meant to escape. The sound of their footsteps echoed in quiet rhythm as Lena walked beside him, each step measured, controlled, but nothing about this felt like control anymore, not when every inch of space between them seemed charged with something unseen, something that pressed against her senses in a way she could not ignore, and she kept her gaze forward, her posture steady, because looking at him again felt dangerous in a way she did not understand. The corridors shifted as they moved, stone giving way to higher ceilings, wider halls, places where fewer servants were allowed to walk, and Lena felt it immediately, the difference in the air, the weight of presence, of power, and she knew without asking where he was taking her. No one spoke as they passed. Guards stepped aside instantly, their eyes lowering in respect, but Lena could feel their awareness, could feel the questions that followed in her wake, because she did not belong here, not beside him, not walking as if she had been summoned for something more than routine. Kale did not slow, did not explain, and that silence carried its own meaning, because he did not need to justify his actions to anyone, least of all her, and yet there was something deliberate in the path he chose, something that suggested purpose rather than impulse, and that unsettled her more than anything else. They reached a set of tall doors, carved and worn with age, and the moment they opened, the space beyond swallowed sound, swallowed movement, leaving only stillness behind, and Lena hesitated for the briefest second before stepping inside. The chamber was vast but quiet, light filtering through high windows and pale lines that stretched across the floor, and at its center, nothing moved, nothing demanded attention, and yet everything felt watched, as if the room itself held memory. Kale stopped a few steps in, and Lena followed, the distance between them shifting again, no longer dictated by walls or corridors, but by something far less tangible, something that tightened with every passing second. He turned then, slowly, his gaze settling on her once more, not searching now, not questioning, but studying, as if the answers he needed were already there, just beneath the surface, waiting to be revealed. "No one enters this place without purpose," he said quietly, his voice carrying through the stillness with ease. And Lena felt the weight of those words settle over her, not as a warning, but as a truth she could not ignore. Her fingers tightened slightly at her sides, her breath steady but shallow, because she understood what he was saying without him needing to explain. And for the first time since this began, she realized that this was not about finding something anymore. It was about confirming it. "You said you heard nothing," he continued, his tone even, but there was something beneath it now, something sharper, more focused, and Lena held his gaze, her silence deliberate, because there was nothing she could say that would not change everything. The quiet stretched, longer this time, heavier, until it felt like the air itself was waiting. And then he stepped closer, not abruptly, not forcefully, but with a certainty that made the distance between them disappear entirely. And Lena felt it again, that pull, stronger now, undeniable, like something within her responding whether she wanted it to or not. "Then why?" he said, softer now, but far more dangerous. "Does it still feel like you are holding something back?" The question did not demand an answer. It drew one out, and Lena's throat tightened as the memory of that note rose again, clearer now, stronger, as if the silence she had forced upon it was beginning to crack under pressure. She took a breath, slow, controlled, her voice barely more than a whisper when it finally came, not a confession, not an explanation, but something closer to truth than anything she had allowed herself to speak in years. "Because some things are not meant to be heard," she said, and the moment the words left her, the stillness in the room shifted, subtle but absolute, as if something had been acknowledged that could no longer be undone. Cale did not look away, did not step back, and for a second, his expression changed, not visibly, not in a way anyone else would notice, but enough that Lena felt it, that shift from certainty to something deeper, something far more dangerous, because it carried intent. "Then let me decide that," he said quietly, and in that moment, Lena understood something she had been trying to deny since the beginning. This was never about whether she would be found. It was about what would happen when she was, and now there was no distance left to protect her from it. The silence that followed his words did not feel empty. It felt full, like the moment before something irreversible takes shape, and Lena stood there, unmoving, her breath steady but shallow, because she understood now that there was no answer she could give that would return things to what they had been, no path that led back to safety, only forward into something unknown. Cale did not rush her, did not repeat himself, but the weight of his presence made waiting feel like pressure, like something that demanded resolution whether she was ready or not. And she could feel it building, that quiet force inside her that had been held back for so long it had become part of her identity, part of her survival. Her fingers curled slightly at her sides, not from fear, but from the effort of holding everything in place, holding herself in place, because she had lived her entire life learning how to contain what she was, how to silence it before it could take shape, before it could be heard, before it could change anything. But something was different now. The pull she felt was no longer distant, no longer something she could ignore or outrun. It was here, present, alive in the space between them, responding to him in a way she could not fully understand. And for the first time, silence felt less like protection and more like resistance against something inevitable. Cale's gaze did not waver, and though his expression remained controlled, there was something unmistakable in it now, something that had shifted from curiosity into certainty. And when he took another step closer, the distance between them disappeared entirely, leaving no space for hesitation, no space for retreat. "You think silence will protect you," he said quietly, not as an accusation, but as a realization, and Lena felt the truth of it settle deep in her chest, because it had always protected her. It had always been enough, until now. She swallowed, her throat tight, her voice barely more than a breath when she answered, because even now, even here, she could not let it go so easily. "It always has," she said, and the honesty in those words felt heavier than anything she had spoken before. Cale studied her for a moment longer, and then something changed again, subtle but absolute, like a decision made without doubt. And when he spoke next, his voice carried something deeper than command, something that did not ask for permission. Not anymore. The words settled between them with finality, And before she could respond, before she could retreat back into the silence that had defined her for so long, something within her shifted, not breaking, not losing control, but unlocking, like a door that had been closed for too long and could no longer hold against what pressed from the other side. Lena felt it rise, that familiar warmth, that quiet energy that had always lived just beneath her restraint. And this time, she did not push it down, did not force it back into silence, because something inside her understood what she had been trying not to see, that this moment was not an accident, not something she could undo, but something she had been moving toward. Without knowing it, her breath steadied, her eyes lifting to meet his fully now, without avoidance, without retreat, and for the first time, she did not try to disappear. The room seemed to hold still around them as she parted her lips, not in fear, not in hesitation, but in choice, and the sound that followed was soft, barely more than a thread of melody, but it carried, clear and undeniable, filling the space with something that did not belong to silence. It was not loud, not overwhelming, but it was real, and the moment it existed, everything changed. The air itself seemed to respond, the stillness shifting into something alive, something aware, and Cale did not move, did not interrupt, but his gaze sharpened, not in shock, not in disbelief, but in recognition, as if what he had been searching for had finally taken form before him. Lena felt it too, the way the sound did not fade the way it should have, the way it lingered, stronger with each second she allowed it to exist, and for the first time in her life, she did not try to stop it. When the note finally ended, the silence that followed was different, no longer empty, no longer safe, but filled with something irreversible, something that could not be taken back, and Lena's heart beat steadily in her chest as she faced him, knowing that everything had changed, not just for her, but for him as well. Cale took one slow breath, his gaze never leaving hers, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but carried more certainty than anything she had heard yet. "I will never stop hearing that," he said, and though the words were simple, Lena understood the truth behind them, not as a promise,